I stood on the front porch of my own house at 9 o'clock at night, in the cold, holding a key that would not turn in the lock. I want you to picture it with me, because I have played it back 1,000 times since. My suitcase was at my feet. My porch light, the one I have switched on every evening for 40 years, was dark. But the windows were not. Every window in my house was glowing warm and gold, the way a home glows when there are people inside it, laughing, moving from room to room, comfortable. I could hear a young woman's laughter through the glass, a laugh I had never heard before in my life. And my key, my own key, the key I had carried in my purse for 4 decades, simply would not go into the lock, because the lock was not my lock anymore. Somebody had changed the locks on my house while I was away, and somebody was inside it right now, warm and happy and at home, in the home that my husband and I had paid off with 40 years of our lives. My name is Margaret. My late husband Raymond always called me Meg, and this is the story of the night I came home a day early and found strangers living in my house, and what I chose to do about it, which was not at all the thing you would expect a frightened old woman to do. I am going to ask you the same thing I always ask. Stay with me all the way to the end, because by the end of this story, you are going to understand exactly what those lights meant, exactly who had changed my locks and why, and exactly what I did the next morning that none of them ever saw coming. And there is one small thing you deserve to know right at the start. One detail that will not make sense until much later. Standing there on my own porch, in the dark, locked out of my own life, listening to a stranger laugh in my kitchen, I did not knock. I did not bang on the door. I did not cry. I picked up my suitcase, and I walked back to my car, and I smiled. By the end of tonight, you will understand why. So let me take you back to the beginning, to 3 weeks earlier, and to a conversation with my son that sounded, at the time, like nothing but love. It was my son David's idea that I take a trip. He came by on a Sunday, and he sat at my kitchen table, and he told me, in the gentlest voice, that he had been worrying about me. He said I looked tired. He said I had been through so much since his father passed, 3 years of grief and paperwork and holding everything together alone, and that I deserved a real rest. And then he told me he had found the perfect place. A lakeside wellness lodge, several states away, quiet and beautiful, with walking trails and a spa and gentle company my own age. He had already looked at the dates. He wanted to send me for 2 whole weeks, all arranged, all paid for, as a gift, because I had given so much to this family, and it was time somebody gave something back to me. I want you to understand how that landed on a lonely widow's heart. My son, sitting at my table, telling me I mattered, telling me I deserved rest, offering me a gift out of nowhere. I cried a little, right there at the table. I thought, I have raised a good man. I told him yes, of course I told him yes. I will be honest with you, because I promised at the start that I would be. There was one small moment, one flicker, that I brushed away. When I asked David who would look after the house while I was gone, he answered a little too fast. He told me not to worry about a single thing, that he and Sharon would keep a close eye on the place, that they had a spare key, that I should just go and relax and let them handle everything. And for just a second, something in me went quiet and careful. I had given David a spare key years ago for emergencies, the way you do with a grown child, but the way he said it, that they would handle everything, sat oddly in my chest, the way a word sits oddly when someone has practiced it. I told myself I was a suspicious old woman looking for problems where there were none. I told myself my son loved me. I still believe he did, in his way. That is the part of this that I will carry for the rest of my life. So I went. I packed my good sweaters and Raymond's old paperback that I still read on trips because his notes are in the margins, and I got on a plane, and I went to the lake. And for the first few days, it was lovely. It truly was. I walked the trails in the cool mornings. I slept later than I had slept in years. I sat by the water in the afternoons and watched the light move across it, and I let myself be quiet, and I let myself, just for a little while, feel taken care of. That is a dangerous feeling for a woman who has been lonely a long time. It makes you willing to overlook things. It makes you grateful in a way that quiets your good sense. but there were small moments, even then, that I brushed aside. When I called David to tell him I had arrived safely, he seemed distracted, almost impatient, and there were voices in the background at my house, more voices than there should have been. And when I asked who was there, he told me it was just Sharon helping with a few things, and changed the subject. Another evening, I tried to call the house phone, the old landline that has hung on my kitchen wall for 30 years, just to hear my own home ringing, the way you do when you are far away and a little homesick. It rang and no one answered, which was ordinary enough, except that the next morning David asked me, a shade too casually, why I had called the house, and I had never told him that I had, which meant that someone had been standing in my kitchen, looking at my telephone, watching my name light up on it, and had mentioned it to him. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself to stop looking for shadows. I was so very good, in those days, at telling myself to stop looking. Then, on the 9th day, my neighbor Loretta sent me a text message, and everything I had told myself began to come apart. Loretta has lived across the street from me for 22 years. She waters my plants, she knows my life, and her message was simple and confused. She asked me whether I had rented out my house. She said she had seen a young couple she did not recognize pulling suitcases up my front walk that afternoon, letting themselves in with a code at the door, laughing, making themselves at home. She said there had been different people the week before, too. She said she only asked because it seemed unlike me, and she wanted to make sure everything was all right. I read that message standing by the lake, and the ground seemed to tilt under me, because I had not rented out my house. I had not given anyone permission to be in my house. I did not even know what she meant by a code at the door. My house has a lock and a key, the way it has had for 40 years. Strangers with suitcases were letting themselves into my home, and my neighbor thought I knew, and I did not know anything at all. Now, a younger woman might have called her son in a panic. I did not. I do not know exactly what stopped me, except that the same quiet, careful voice that had flickered when David said he would handle everything was now wide awake and speaking very clearly. And what it told me was this: do not call, do not warn them, find out for yourself, first, before anyone knows that you know. So I sat down on a bench by that beautiful lake, and I took out my phone, and I did something I had never done before in my life. I searched for my own address on a vacation rental website, and there it was. There was my house, my home, listed for rent by the night, to strangers, with photographs. Someone had walked through my house with a camera and photographed my rooms and put them on the internet for money. There was my living room, with Raymond's chair moved out of it. There was my kitchen. There was a photograph captioned as a cozy guest nook, and it was Raymond's study, his books boxed away and gone, a little bed put in their place. And there was a photograph they had labeled the master suite. It was my bedroom. It was the bed I had shared with my husband for 40 years, the bed he died in, made up with strange white linens for strangers to sleep in, for money. And the worst of it, the thing that truly stopped my breath, was the reviews. There were reviews. Other people, strangers, had already stayed in my home and written little notes about it. One of them thanked the host for the lovely, quiet neighborhood. One of them mentioned how comfortable the master bed was. Someone had slept in my bed, and gotten up, and written a public sentence about how comfortable it was, and given it stars, as though my life were a hotel. There were dates going back nearly 2 weeks, which meant this had started almost the moment my plane left the ground. The gift, the lake, the 2 weeks of rest, all of it had been timed. All of it had been arranged so that the house would be empty and the strangers could begin. The listing was managed by a host, and the host's name was Sharon. My daughter-in-law. I sat on that bench for a very long time. I did not cry, which surprised me. I think I was past crying. What I felt instead was a kind of cold and terrible clarity. The clarity you feel when a thing you have been squinting at for weeks suddenly comes into perfect focus. Every small moment I had brushed aside came back to me and clicked into place. The voices in the background, the impatience, the question about why I had called my own house, the too fast answer about handling everything. It had not been my imagination. It had never been my imagination. My good sense had been trying to tell me the truth for 3 weeks, and I had kept telling it to be quiet because the lie was so much warmer than the truth. My son had not sent me away to rest. My son and his wife had sent me away so that they could turn my home into a business behind my back. The gift was not a gift. It was a way to get me out of the house. And in that moment, on that bench, I made 3 decisions, very calmly, one after another. The first was that I was not going to spend one more night at that lovely lake, pretending to rest while strangers slept in my husband's bed. The second was that I was not going to tell David or Sharon a single word about what I knew. And the third was that I was going home a full day early, quietly, on the next flight I could find, so that I could see it all with my own 2 eyes before anyone had the chance to arrange a story for me. I changed my flight that afternoon. I told no one. And the next evening, a day before anyone expected me, I took a taxi from the airport to my own street, and I asked the driver to let me out at the corner, and I walked the last little way to my house in the dark, pulling my suitcase behind me, with my heart going like a drum. And that brings us back to the porch, to the dark porch light and the glowing windows, and the laughter I did not recognize and the key that would not turn. I stood there, and I looked through the front window, and I saw them. A young man and a young woman, perhaps 30 years old, sitting on a sofa that was not mine, in the spot where my sofa used to be, drinking wine out of glasses I did not own, with their shoes off and their feet up, watching my television, in my living room, as comfortable as anything, nice-looking young people. Ordinary young people. They had done nothing wrong that they knew of. They had rented a lovely house for a few nights and had no idea that the woman who owned it was standing in the dark on the porch, locked out, watching them live in her home. Raymond's chair was gone from the corner. My photographs were gone from the walls. On the little table by the window, where I have kept the same lamp for 20 years, there was now a basket of the sort of things a hotel leaves out, little soaps and a folded card, and a laminated sheet that I would later learn listed the house rules, the internet password, and the hour by which guests were expected to check out, of my home. The warm little life that my husband and I had built, 40 years of it, every anniversary and every quiet Sunday and every ordinary Tuesday, had been swept into boxes and carried off somewhere to make room for paying strangers, and I was standing outside all of it in the cold, an old woman with a suitcase, holding a key to a lock that no longer existed. I have felt many things in my life. I do not think I had ever, until that moment on that porch, felt quite so much like a ghost, like someone who had died, and whose family had already moved on and rented out the rooms, except that I was not dead. I was standing right there. And here's the thing I told you to wait for. I did not knock. I looked at those 2 harmless young people enjoying my living room, and I felt the anger rise up in me, hot and enormous, the anger of a lifetime, and then I felt it settle back down into something much colder and much more useful. Because I realized, standing there, that I already had everything I needed. I had seen the listing, I had the screenshots, I knew Sharon's name was on it, and I knew one more thing, the thing that David and Sharon had either forgotten or never understood, the thing that was going to matter more than anything else the next morning. So I did not knock. I picked up my suitcase and I walked back to my car at the corner, and yes, I smiled. Not a happy smile. The smile of a woman who has just realized that the people who thought they had trapped her have in fact handed her the key to trapping them. I drove to a small motel 2 miles away, and I paid for a room, and I sat on the edge of a strange bed, and I did not sleep much, but I did not spend the night weeping either. I spent it thinking, planning, because I have learned in 72 years that the loudest thing you can do is almost never the strongest thing you can do. A woman who bangs on the door and screams at strangers in the night is a woman making a scene, and a scene can be explained away. A woman who says nothing and waits and moves in the daylight with the truth on her side is something else entirely. She is a reckoning. I have thought a great deal since that night about why I did not fall apart in that motel room, and I think it is this. When you have buried a husband, you have already survived the worst night of your life, and every hard night after it is measured against that one and found smaller. I had sat up alone the night Raymond died. I had learned in the years since that I was stronger than I had ever been given the chance to know, and some cold, steady part of me, sitting on that motel bed, understood that this was not a night for grief. Grief is for things you cannot change. This was something I could change. This was a night for planning. So let me tell you about the thing that David and Sharon had forgotten, because it is the whole hinge of this story. When Raymond and I bought that house 40 years ago, we bought it together, both our names on the deed, a young couple with a baby on the way and more hope than money. I remember the day we signed for it. Raymond was so proud he could hardly hold the pen, and afterward we sat on the bare floor of the empty living room and ate sandwiches out of wax paper because we had no furniture yet, and he told me that this was the room where we would grow old. And we did. And when Raymond died, 3 years ago, the house passed entirely to me. Not to David, not to the family, to me. My name and my name alone was on the deed to that house. I had never added David to it, not because I did not trust him, but because Raymond had always said a house should have one clear owner and no confusion, and I had honored that. So whatever David and Sharon believed, whatever they had told themselves about the house sitting empty and going to waste and being as good as theirs someday, the plain fact, the legal fact, was that they did not own one single brick of it. They had no right to be in it. They had no right to list it. They had no right to change the locks. And the strangers on my sofa were not my tenants. They were, though they did not know it, sleeping in a house that had been rented to them by two people who had no authority to rent it at all. I also had one more thing, and this one mattered to me more than the deed, though not in a legal way. A week before I left for the lake, my granddaughter Emma, who is 16, had sent me a text message that I had not understood at the time. She had written, in the careful way that teenagers write when they are trying to say something without saying it, that she thought it was a little weird how much time her parents had been spending at my house lately, and how her mom kept taking pictures of everything, and she asked me if I knew about it, and if everything was okay. I had written back something reassuring, and thought nothing more of it. But sitting in that motel, I understood. My granddaughter had tried to warn me. She had felt that something was wrong, and she had reached out, and she had not known how to say it plainly, and I had missed it. That girl was the one honest heart in that house, and I was not going to let what her parents had done fall on her. I slept perhaps 2 hours, but something happens to a woman my age when she finally stops being afraid and starts being certain. The tiredness lifts, the hands go steady. I have felt it only a few times in my life, and each time it has frightened the people who thought I was harmless. I got up before the sun, and I made myself a cup of weak motel coffee, and I sat by the window and I wrote out, on the back of a motel notepad, a list of everything I was going to do, in order, the way Raymond taught me to break a big frightening job into small, unfrightening steps. And then, when the world woke up, I put on my good blue coat, and I began, very calmly, to take my life back. I made my first telephone call at 8 o'clock to a locksmith, and I asked him to meet me at my address at 10. He asked if it was an emergency, and I told him, in the pleasant voice of a woman who has all the time in the world, that it was simply a woman changing the locks on her own house, which was the most ordinary thing in the world, and he agreed that it was, and he said he would be there. I made my second call to the county, to confirm what I already knew, that the deed was mine and mine alone, and to ask what my rights were regarding people occupying my property without my permission. I was told, very plainly, that the house was entirely mine, and that anyone inside it without my consent was there unlawfully, and that I was well within my rights to reclaim it. I made my third contact to the rental website itself, where I reported that my property had been listed for rent by a person who did not own it and had no authority to do so, and I provided proof that I was the sole owner. I was told the listing would be removed and the host account frozen while they investigated, and that any pending payouts would be held. Which meant that whatever money Sharon had made renting out my home was, as of that morning, going nowhere. And then, at 10 o'clock, I drove to my own house in the daylight with a locksmith, and I knocked on my own front door. The young couple answered, and I will tell you, I felt for them. I truly did. I explained to them, as kindly as I could, that I was the owner of the house, that I lived there, that it had been listed for rent by people who had no right to list it, and that they were, through no fault of their own, the victims of a dishonest arrangement. I showed them my identification with the address on it. I showed them the deed. I watched the confusion and then the embarrassment cross their faces, and I told them, gently, that none of this was their doing, and that I was terribly sorry their little trip had ended this way, and that they should gather their things and contact the website for their refund, which they would certainly receive. They were good young people. They apologized to me over and over, though they had nothing to apologize for, and within the hour they were gone, and then I stood, for the first time in over 2 weeks, inside my own home. It was not my home, not the way it had been. My furniture was gone, replaced with cheap rented pieces. My photographs were gone. Raymond's study had been emptied of his books and turned into a rentable room. And in my bedroom, on the bed where my husband had lived and died, there were strange sheets and a stranger's forgotten sock on the floor. I stood in that doorway for a long moment, and that was the only time that morning that I let myself weep, quietly, for the violation of it, for the boxes of my life shoved into who knows where, for the strangers who had slept where Raymond slept. And then I dried my eyes, because I had work to do, and grief could wait until the work was done. I walked through the whole house slowly, room by room, taking an inventory of what had been done to it. In the kitchen, my good dishes had been pushed to the back of the cupboards to make room for a matched set of plain white ones, the kind you buy in a hurry to photograph well. In the hall closet, I found a stack of folded linens that were not mine, and a laundry schedule taped to the inside of the door in Sharon's handwriting, as though my home were a small business she was running, which of course to her, it was. And in the garage, under a tarp, I found the beginnings of my own life, boxed and labeled in marker. One box said photos, one said Ray study. One, and I had to sit down on an overturned crate when I saw it, simply said mom bedroom, as though I were a category of clutter to be stored. My whole married life, reduced to cardboard and shoved into the garage so that strangers would not have to look at it. The locksmith arrived at 10, and he changed every lock in the house, the front door and the back door and the side door into the garage. I stood there and I watched him do it, and I found it was one of the most satisfying sounds I have ever heard, the small, firm click of a new lock seating into a door that is yours. And when he handed me the new keys, warm from his hand and shining, I closed my fingers around them, and I felt, for the first time in weeks, like I was standing on solid ground. Before I did anything else, I walked across the street, and I knocked on Loretta's door, and when she opened it and saw me standing there, she put her hand to her mouth. I told her what had happened, all of it, plainly, and I watched her face go from confusion to understanding, to a good, honest anger on my behalf. She told me she had felt in her bones that something was not right, that she had almost driven to the police station herself, that she had lain awake over it. And I took both of her hands in mine and I thanked her, because I want you to understand something. It was not my son who protected me. It was not my family. It was a woman across the street who has watered my plants for 22 years and who noticed strangers with suitcases and cared enough to send one text message. That message is the only reason I came home a day early. That message is the reason this story ends the way it does and not some other, worse way. Never underestimate the neighbor who pays attention. Sometimes the whole of your rescue arrives in a single text from someone who simply loves you enough to ask if you are all right. I did not call David. I waited. Because I knew that Sharon would try to log into her rental account, or one of them would get an alert that the listing had been removed, and that they would come to me. And I wanted them to come to me, on my ground, in my daylight, with the truth already settled and the locks already changed. It took until early afternoon. David's car pulled into my driveway, and he and Sharon came up the walk, and I met them on the porch. On my porch, under my porch light, which I had switched back on, and I did not let them inside. David started talking before he even reached the steps, and I am not going to give you his exact words because they do not deserve to be repeated, but I will tell you the shape of them. He told me it was not what it looked like. He told me they had only been trying to help me, that the house was just sitting there empty while I rattled around in it alone, that they had been meaning to tell me, that it was practically a favor to keep the place lived in and earning a little money, that at my age I did not need all that space anyway, and that I was overreacting to something that was really quite reasonable when I calmed down and thought about it. Sharon stood behind him and told me that the money was going to be used for the family, as though that made a theft into a kindness. And underneath all of it, underneath every word, was the same thing I had felt flicker in my chest 3 weeks earlier at my kitchen table. The quiet, breathtaking assumption that my home and my life and my dignity were simply theirs to arrange. I let them finish. I have found that it is best to let people show you the whole of themselves before you answer, because people will always tell you exactly who they are if you give them enough silence to do it in. And the longer they talked, the clearer it became. They were not sorry. They were sorry that I had come home early. They were sorry that the plan had broken. Not once, in all of it, did either of them look at that bed where their father and grandfather had died, made up for strangers, and feel ashamed. They only wanted to know how quickly they could talk me back into being quiet and grateful and out of the way. And when they were done, I spoke, and I did not raise my voice, because I have never once in my life needed to raise my voice to be heard. I told them that I knew everything. I told them I had seen the listing, that I had the photographs of my own bedroom labeled as a suite for strangers, that I knew Sharon's name was the host, and that I had reported it and it was gone and the money was frozen and it was going to be returned. I told them that the deed to this house had my name on it, and only my name, and that it always had, and that they did not own one brick of it and never had. I told them the locks were already changed that morning, and that they would not be given a key, not now, not ever again. And then I told them the thing that finally made my son go pale and silent, the thing that mattered most of all. I told them that I had spent the previous 3 years believing that when I was gone, this house, and everything I had, would go to David, because he was my son, and I loved him, and that is what a mother does. And I told them that the night I stood locked out on my own porch, listening to strangers laugh in my kitchen, I had understood at last exactly what kind of people they had chosen to be, and that I would be making entirely different arrangements now. I did not do it out of revenge. I said this to them plainly. I did it because a person who would send their own mother away in order to rent out the bed her husband died in has told you, very clearly, who they are, and it would be a foolish woman indeed who did not believe them. David tried, at the end, to make it about money, to say that they were struggling, that they needed it. And I told him the truth, which is that struggle is a misfortune, and I have compassion for misfortune, but that he had not come to me struggling, with his hat in his hand, asking his mother for help. He had gone behind my back and dressed a betrayal up as a gift and shipped me off to a lake so that strangers could sleep in my home, and a man who does that is not struggling, he is choosing, and I would not reward the choice. Then I asked them to leave my porch, and after a moment they did. Now, I want to tell you the last part because it is the part that matters most to me, and it is not about David at all. It is about my granddaughter. That evening, once the house was quiet and the locks were mine, I called Emma, and I want you to know that I did not say one unkind word to that girl about her mother and father. What I said to her was that I had seen her text message, the one from before I left, and that she had been right, that something had been wrong, and that she had been braver and more honest than any adult in that house, and that none of what had happened was her fault, not one bit of it, and that she would always have a grandmother, and a place at my table, and a home to come to, for as long as I drew breath. She cried on the phone. She told me through her tears that she had known something was wrong, and had not been sure, and that she had felt sick about it for weeks, and that she had been afraid to say anything because they were her parents, and she did not want to be the one who caused trouble. And I told her the truest thing I know, which is that she had not caused the trouble. The people who did the wrong thing caused the trouble. The person who notices it and finds the courage to speak has never caused anything but the beginning of it being made right. I told her that she must never, as long as she lived, let anyone convince her that telling the truth is the same as making trouble, because the people who benefit from your silence will always try to teach you that it is. And then I told her that I loved her, and that being honest when it is hard and frightening and costly is the finest thing a person can be, and that her grandfather Raymond would have been so proud of her that he would not have been able to speak, because that is the thing I understood, standing in my reclaimed house that night. You can lose a great deal to people's greed. You can lose your furniture and your privacy and your trust and, hardest of all, the version of your child that you believed in. But you do not have to lose yourself, and you do not have to let the worst people in the story decide what the story means. So now you know. Now you know what those glowing lights meant. The night I stood locked out on my own porch. They were strangers, paying by the night to sleep in my home, in a scheme my own son and his wife had built behind my back, after shipping me off to a lake and calling it a gift. That was what the laughter was. That was why my key would not turn. Someone had decided that my home was empty space to be sold, and that I was a small problem to be moved out of the way. And now you know why I smiled on that porch instead of knocking. I smiled because in the very moment they thought they had locked me out of my own life, I understood that they had made one enormous mistake. They had forgotten whose name was on the deed. They had forgotten that a woman who has kept her own counsel for 72 years does not need to scream to win. And they had handed me, in their arrogance, every single thing I needed to take it all back. So I did not knock, because I did not need to. I simply went home the next morning in the daylight, with the truth in my hand, and I changed the locks on my own front door, and I took my life back one quiet phone call at a time. I had the house professionally cleaned, every inch of it. I found my furniture in a rented storage unit, the address of which I made David give me, and I brought Raymond's chair home and set it back in its corner by the window. I hung our photographs again, and the first night I slept in my own bed, in my own home, with my own new keys on the nightstand, I slept better than I had in 3 years. My granddaughter comes to see me most Sundays now. My son and I are not what we were, and I do not know if we ever will be, and I have made my peace with not knowing. Some doors you leave open a crack, and some doors you change the locks on, and wisdom is knowing which is which. Here is what I want to say to you before I go, because I believe somebody listening needs to hear it tonight. If there is a voice in your life telling you that you are tired, that you need a rest, that you should go away for a while and let someone else handle everything, I am not telling you to distrust it. Most of the time it is love, but you are allowed to notice how it is said. You are allowed to listen to the quiet, careful voice in your own chest. You are allowed to come home a day early, and if you ever find strangers living in the life you built, I want you to remember an old woman who stood locked out on her own porch and did not panic and did not beg, but simply went home the next morning and changed the locks. Your home is not empty space. Your life is not an inconvenience, and you are never, ever too old to take back what is yours. So tell me in the comments, has someone ever tried to move you out of your own life while smiling and calling it a favor? I read every one, and I think the people gathered here tonight need to hear each other. If you believe an old woman still has the right to come home to her own house, then stay a while and subscribe, and I will see you at the next one. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. There is always a place for you here, and I will keep it warm.